Donald Trump has launched his new diplomatic forum aimed at resolving international conflicts. Chaired by the president himself, the Board of Peace brings together a loose grouping of national leaders and strategic partners with no fixed membership or treaty-based mandate. President Trump and representatives of several countries signed the document formally establishing the board. Many US allies are opting out of the plan, and Russia is the only other permanent member of the UN Security Council that hasn't ruled out joining. But Mr. Trump says the board could expand to deal with conflicts around the world and work with the UN.
It's the chance to be one of the most consequential bodies ever created, and it's my enormous honor to serve as its chairman. I was very honored when they asked me to do it. We had an idea to do it, and then they came. They said, "You be the chairman." And but I take it very seriously. We have a great group of people. Every one of you, we are truly honored by your presence today. Leaders of countries, in most cases, very popular leaders. Some cases, not so popular, but that's the way it goes in life. Today, the world is richer, safer, and much more peaceful than it was just 1 year ago. We put out all those fires. A lot of people didn't know, including me, that some of those wars were going on.
Joining me now to discuss this further is political analyst Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Foundation. Welcome back to DW. President Trump says his new Board of Peace could eventually rival the United Nations. What do you think? Could it?
Well, I think the eventually is the important part here. You've had to have a leader on it who's sought by the International Criminal Court. You've got monarchs who have business with this government. You have a number of somewhat shady world leaders who've decided to sign up right away, ones that, in fact, need to benefit from the purse strings of the American president that this board comes with. You'll remember it has a pay-to-play strategy, meaning to say, ideally, you're paying $1 billion to join. This all sounds like it's part of Donald Trump's larger version of international grift, and hence the Europeans were not part of the signing ceremony.
Right. So it's important, one, not to get sued, and two, to try and disentangle what's going on here. Do you see this as a serious political, diplomatic initiative and grift, as you put it? Do you see these two going hand in hand, or do you see one playing a bigger part than the other?
Well, I think Donald Trump, as in many international conflicts, would like to offload some of the financial burden, frankly, that being an international player takes. We've seen a version where he's forced the Europeans into buying weapon systems to support Ukraine, also a big topic today at Davos. And in this case, he would like to get, much like the real estate broker he has always been, other powers to, quote unquote, help rebuild Gaza. The urgency we just heard in your previous interview is looming large, but in parallel, you can see that the UN systems are springing into action to try to support the urgent needs on the ground. None of the countries that have signed up to this Board of Peace have that kind of sort of sway to do what's right for the people of Gaza, or haven't been known to have that kind of input, influence, and desire. They mean it. They want to be part of this so that they can curry favor with the president, and the president wants to use them to do some of his bidding. So maybe there is a cross opportunity here, but it certainly cannot, shall not, and will not rival the United Nations.
OK. And we, as you alluded to there, we have various European countries having nothing to do with this, deciding that they will not take part. So from a transatlantic perspective, how significant is this move?
Well, it just says the Europeans are making a marker, and we heard, by the way, President Zelensky call for the Europeans to make that marker more strongly for the international rule of law and for the competence of diplomacy. And the EU countries will continue to work within the UN framework. They certainly have no ambitions to take their taxpayer money to join a Board of Peace where the outcomes are unclear and seem to be headed toward the ideas of rebuilding a new gilded Gaza. That's not in the intention of the Europeans. They want this conflict to end in a sustainable manner. They want, fundamentally, I think, in their bones, for both sides to be able to cohabitate And the venue to do that is through the lens of international law, is through the venue of international law, and that remains the United Nations.
OK, let's hear from the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, speaking today at the World Economic Forum, and then we'll come back to you.
Now, in recent days, the United States administration has vehemently demanded greater influence in Greenland. Washington has argued that this is an imperative to counter security threats in the High North. We welcome that the United States is taking the threat posed by Russia in the Arctic seriously. We share the conviction that, as European NATO allies, we must do more to secure the High North as NATO. This is a common transatlantic interest.
Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, don't you have any sympathy for Donald Trump? The Europeans did little about paying sensible amounts for their own security before he bullied them into it. Same for what they are now calling, what the Chancellor has just called, the threats to the High North. They're taking it seriously now because Trump put the issue on the table.
Well, I think if you call a threat that's a real threat and you invest in securing against those threats, that's wonderful. For that, I want continued American engagement in Ukraine, where the threat is rife, where Ukrainian citizens are facing a new onslaught of bombardment in freezing temperatures. The High North is an issue, has been an issue. We could have long politicized and strategized around the Arctic Council, which is fundamentally an apolitical council, but includes all the countries around the Arctic, Russia as well, and made that a greater diplomatic forum. Fine, you can double down on the NATO Arctic strategy. I think that's also good. But if you look at Russian naval capacities in the Arctic, and the fleet capacities there are probably the strongest within the Russian Navy, but compared to an American Navy, compared to what NATO can do in terms of its strength of its Navy, either from the UK shores or from Denmark, Russia at this point is not an urgent threat in the Arctic. Do we need to make sure that it remains a non-urgent threat in the Arctic? Absolutely. If we're going to push ahead with that, wonderful. If we're going to do it in a united fashion under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, all the better. If it takes up some urgency, then maybe Trump had a little moment of righteous energy there. But overall, you don't need to extort an ally to get to that ambition.
Except that it looks like, in practical terms, you do. If you say that Russia is not an urgent threat in the Arctic, and yet all the Europeans are now saying, well, yes, no, Russia is an urgent threat in the Arctic, and we are doing lots about it, Donald.
Well, I think, you've got to give, you've always got to give Donald Trump some strategic foresight and clarity. It is true, as Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, put it in Davos yesterday, that only with Donald Trump's pressure have you seen reluctant allies pay their 2% of GDP. Perhaps that push is necessary. Again, the Europeans are getting it up the head from different sides, including, by the way, from the Ukrainian president just a few hours ago, that they need to realize their power and put their house together and then pair up with Mark Carney's vision of middle powers in the world. That's an education in and of itself for the Europeans. That's good. They have to say this, but then they have to continue to mean this by investing in defense capacities in the Arctic. If Russia then still remains a distant threat, all the better. Then the Europeans and the Americans and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is yet better prepared.
OK, so lots in there, but you say the Europeans have to say it and they have to mean it and they have to keep doing it. Yet there was Ukraine and then there was Russia's invasion and then everybody threw their hands up and said, oh, this is terrible, we must do something. And then now there's this threat to Greenland and everyone's throwing their hands up and saying, oh, this is terrible, we must do something. Lots of talk. Where's the action? And where, to take up your point, is the sustained action?
Well, I think the sustained action, I mean, look, you are implying my frustrations, which I think many of us have, because the urgency of the moment is sort of beyond the 3 minutes to 12 structure that we often use in terms of the functionality of international relations. Now we've got to see more action and fundamentally more investments. The Europeans have put their house in order in the sense that they now have better instruments, by the way, to counter threats by Donald Trump, both on the economic side, but certainly on the military side. NATO has upped their spending now. They need to put it in the kind of defense materiel that will actually look at the conflicts of the future and not the conflicts of the past. So it's less about buying heavy armed vehicles and more about buying drones and flexible armored systems so that you can actually deal with the challenges of the future, which might include conflicts in the perma-ice and the permafrost. And then they have to think much more about securing their economic systems. Because one thing that Russia will surely continue to do, even if this meeting between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Americans yields some results, is they will continue attacking European economic systems. The Germans lose 289 billion euros every year just from the attacks coming into their economic system. They've got to make sure their own shop is safe and then invest in wider ways of resilient defense. If they can get that right and integrate it and do it quickly, exactly to your point, then Europeans will feel a lot better off speaking more loudly their truth to power to an American president.
Good talking to you as ever, Cathryn. Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Foundation.
My pleasure.
Let's get more on this from Mujtaba Rahman. He's Managing Director for Europe at the Eurasia Group. Welcome to DW. Let's start with Greenland and where Europe and NATO are now that Donald Trump has walked back his threat to take it by force. There is said to be a deal on the table. Do you still feel that this is an issue that could break NATO, as you wrote in an article a while back?
I don't think it can now break NATO. I think the risk was a land grab by the Trump administration, either through military or economic coercion means, would have fundamentally challenged the alliance in fairly existential ways. It would have called into question US support in the Ukraine theater, a US commitment to a Ukrainian security guarantee as a backstop, as part of a backstop. It would have called into question the US's support in NATO more generally. I think now we're back into a slightly more normal negotiating process between the Danes, the Greenlanders, and the Americans, and indeed NATO. And so I think NATO will certainly survive this crisis, but at some moment the risks look quite profound.
And the Europeans, the EU, they're all huddling in Brussels at the moment, saying that the transatlantic relationship has taken a big blow. The signs have been there for all to see since Trump won, I guess. Why do you think it's taken them so long to arrive at this conclusion?
I don't think they've just arrived at the conclusion. I think the Rubicon was crossed last year when J.D. Vance came to the Munich Security Conference and gave a speech where he effectively said the mortal enemy for Europe lies within and not without. When there was a lot of concern following President Zelensky of Ukraine's humiliation in the Oval Office, that the Americans were going to pull the plug on Ukraine. And I think we saw major reforms in Europe manifest last year. Germany abolished its constitutional debt brake. Since then, it's got a commitment to spend up to 5% of GDP by the end of the decade on security and defence. Other countries are now looking to do the same thing. At the European level, the Commission and the EU institutions, in conjunction with the member states, are looking to build a pan-European collective defence policy. And so I think the Rubicon has been crossed. That Rubicon was crossed last year. I think there is a very clear recognition by member states that America is not coming back, that the world is going to be one with less America in it, and Europe needs to do more to protect its own security and defence, and certainly its own interests in the world. And so I think that lesson has been very well understood, and we've seen policies implemented at the national level that reflect that.
Meanwhile, we still don't know much about what is in this Greenland framework worked out between Donald Trump and Mark Rutte, and neither does Greenland's Prime Minister. What do you think happened between Trump and Rutte last night?
I think Trump faced a wall of opposition from the EU, and leaders were very clear. The goal was to get Trump off this highway where he is driving for sovereign control of the territory of the island of Greenland. And it was the goal was to do that by making clear to Trump that the domestic consequences to him internally within the US, but abroad internationally, will be catastrophic. Now Trump is off that runway. There is a negotiation to be had about reinforcing Europe and America and indeed NATO's presence on the Arctic and doing that through Greenland. But I think the goal was to make clear to Trump the consequences and to hope that he would stand down. And indeed, Trump has done that. And I think part of the reason Trump did it is because of European resolve. The Europeans were actually very united in their commitment to respond to Trump's threats on tariffs and to escalate through the use of other instruments, as Jack has just told your audience, in the event that they needed to. This was not a crisis about Denmark or Greenland. I think for Europe, this was about the UN Charter, territorial integrity, borders, and indeed the right to self-determination for the Greenland population.
Okay.
And that is the reason I think we saw a lot of flexing from Europe in response to the threats that Trump was advancing.
I wonder if you could outline for us briefly what these catastrophic consequences for the United States are likely to be. What will Mark Rutte have said to Donald Trump? Because certainly the way that Trump says it, he doesn't need the rest of the world. America is number one. It can do what it likes from the sky to the sea. So what will Rutte have said to him about the looming catastrophe that will have made an impact on him? Just to outline for us why it is that this would be so bad for the US.
Okay, so it's not Rutte that would have conveyed that message. Other EU leaders in public and private conveyed those messages to the Trump administration. The first would have been trade retaliation. So US goods exports to the single market would have been tariffed up to the volume of 93 billion. So you would have US manufacturers exporting goods to Europe would have faced a fiscal border as they tried to export their goods to the EU single market. That then would have escalated to services. It would have been possible for the EU to constrain the access that US firms have that are trading in services to the single market. It is possible that sanctions would have graduated even further. As European countries are spending on defense, they would have excluded US arms manufacturers from that increase in defense spending. And at the very top of the sanction ladder, it's absolutely possible that the Europeans would have decided to mandate that EU financial institutions must sell or cannot hold US treasuries. And so there is a ratchet of sanctions that EU, I suspect, would have implemented. It wouldn't have been easy. It would have required building consensus. But I think those messages were conveyed to Trump in private and in public that this is not a good idea. And I think it's for that reason the administration and Trump stood down. The deal with NATO, I'll just want to make this point because I think it's important. This is a deal that the Danes and the Greenlanders and NATO have been trying to convince Trump to take for over a year. These negotiations between Denmark and the US are not new. They've been happening for a very long time. And now Trump, I think, has accepted that framework deal that was on the table and that has been worked up by NATO over the past few weeks because he realized this wall of opposition was real and the consequences the US would have faced would have been real as well.
Fascinating analysis. Thank you for laying it out so clearly. Mujtaba Rahman, Managing Director for Europe at the Eurasia Group. Thank you.